Let me tell you something about corporate loyalty that took me decades to learn. When they say you're family, what they really mean is you're useful. Hia. Have you ever been to a party where you're the only one who didn't get the memo on the dress code? That was my grandfather's funeral. Except the dress code wasn't black suits and somber ties. It was performative, theatrical grief. And my aunts and uncles were vying for the lead role. Alex, was apparently the disrespectful stagehand who refused to learn his lines. They sobbed, they wailed, they delivered these flowery, poetic eulogies about a man they hadn't bothered to visit in years. It was a masterclass in hypocrisy. The performance continued at the will reading, where they gathered like vultures, ready to pick the bones of his considerable estate. But my granddad Henry always loved a good punchline, and he saved his best for last. His lawyer played a video, and after a warm greeting for me, Henry looked straight at the camera, a cheerful glint in his eye, and delivered his final line to his other children. He said, "As for the rest of you, I haven't seen you since Christmas 2018, so I've already donated your share of the inheritance to the nursing home staff who actually cared for me." The silence that fell over that mahogany-paneled room was the only genuine thing I'd heard from them all day. And trust me, the story of how we got to that perfect, beautiful silence is even better. The funeral home smelled of lilies and old dust, a cloying combination that stuck to the back of my throat. It was a high-end establishment, the kind my Aunt Carol would have chosen. All dark wood, plush carpets, and hushed, reverent lighting that made everyone look both more solemn and 10 years older. It was a stage, and the cast was warming up. My Aunt Carol, a woman who communicated primarily through dramatic sighs and pointed glances, was holding court near the entrance, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Her husband, my Uncle Robert, stood beside her, his hand on her back in a display of supportive spousal comfort that was about as authentic as a $3 bill. He was a financial advisor, a title he used like a weapon, and you could practically see the gears turning in his head as he mentally appraised the room, the casket, the cost of it all, and how it would affect the bottom line. His bottom line, of course. My other aunt and uncle, Susan and David, had formed their own little pocket of misery near the guest book. Susan was weeping into David's shoulder, her sobs just loud enough to be noticed but not so loud as to be considered gauche. It was a carefully calibrated performance. They looked like the very picture of devoted, heartbroken children. Anyone walking in would have seen them and thought, "Ah, what a loving family. What a terrible loss." I knew better. I was the family's archivist of neglect, the unwilling record keeper of their indifference. I stood by myself near a large, ostentatious floral arrangement that I knew for a fact had been sent by Robert's firm, a tax write-off disguised as sympathy. I wasn't crying. My grief for Grandad Henry was a different thing entirely. It wasn't a sudden storm, it was a quiet, empty space that had opened up inside me. It was the silence on a Saturday afternoon where his rambling stories used to be. It was the unused deck of cards on the small table by his favorite chair. Crying in this place, amidst this circus, felt like a betrayal of that quiet, real thing. It didn't take long for one of them to notice my stoicism. It was Carol, of course. She detached herself from Robert and glided over to me, her face a mask of concern. "Alex, darling," she began, her voice a theatrical whisper. "Are you all right? You seem distant." I just nodded. "I'm okay, Aunt Carol." She placed a cold hand on my arm. Her nails were perfectly manicured. "It's okay to show some emotion, you know. Your grandfather would want to see that you cared. It's a bit, well, it's a bit disrespectful to be so cold. People are watching." There it was, people are watching. That was the core of their entire philosophy. Life wasn't something to be lived, it was a play to be staged for an unseen audience. My quiet personal grief was a problem because it was a deviation from their script. It made their over-the-top sorrow look as fake as it was, and they couldn't have that. "I cared about him a great deal," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. "I don't need to prove it to anyone." Her smile tightened. "Of course, dear. We all did." She gave my arm a final condescending pat and drifted away to receive another wave of sympathizers, her role as chief mourner reinstated. The eulogies were the main event. Uncle Robert went first. He spoke of Grandad's unshakable business acumen and his legacy of financial prudence, which was a ghoulish way of talking about the money he was expecting to inherit. He told an anecdote about a fishing trip from 30 years ago, a story so polished from retelling that it had lost all its original warmth and texture. It was a generic tribute to a generic father, not the sharp, funny, stubborn man I knew. Then came Aunt Susan, who read a saccharine poem about a mighty oak falling in the forest. She choked up at all the right moments. She spoke of his strength and his wisdom, conveniently forgetting the dozens of times she had rolled her eyes at his old-fashioned advice or complained that calling him was a chore. The worst was Carol. She portrayed herself as the dutiful daughter, the one who was always there, her father's rock. She talked about his final years, painting a picture of a man surrounded by loving family. We were all there for him, holding his hand, making sure he never felt alone, she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. I almost laughed. It was a bitter, angry sound that caught in my chest. I was the one who was there. I was the one who held his hand when he was scared. I was the one who listened to him talk for hours about his late wife, my grandmother, and the life they built. I was the one who made sure his bird feeder was always full, who read him the newspaper when his eyes got too tired, who sat in comfortable silence with him, just being present. They weren't there. They were too busy. They had commitments. Their children had soccer practice. There was always an excuse. After the service, as people were milling around, eating the dry sandwiches and drinking the weak coffee the funeral home provided, Uncle David cornered me. He was the good cop of the bunch, the one who used feigned sympathy instead of overt judgment. Hey buddy, he said, slinging an arm around my shoulder. Tough day, huh? Yeah, I mumbled. Listen, I know you spent a lot of time with him at the end. We all really appreciate that. It was hard for us to get away, you know how it is. Work, the kids, I didn't say anything. I just let him talk. Anyway, he continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially, the will reading is tomorrow. 10 a.m. sharp. Albright's office. You know Dad's lawyer, you should be there. I'm sure Dad left you a little something for your time. He said your time like he was talking about hours logged on a timesheet. It was a transaction. I wasn't a grandson. I was the hired help, the errand boy, and now I was going to be tipped out. The condescension in his voice, the casual dismissal of what my relationship with Grandad had actually been, was the final straw. It was the spark that lit the fuse. My quiet grief, which had been a heavy, sad weight, began to change. It started to cool, to harden. It was morphing into something else, something with a sharp edge. It was becoming resolve. They had their script for how the next 24 hours would go. They thought they were the directors, the producers, and the stars of this show. They had no idea that Grandad Henry had already written the final act, and he'd cast me as the one to pull the curtain. The drive home from the funeral was a blur of gray highway and muted anger. The car felt too quiet, a stark contrast to the cacophony of fake sentiment I had just escaped. My grief for Grandad Henry was a constant low hum beneath the surface, but now a new frequency was layered over it, a cold, clear note of indignation. It wasn't just that they were faking it, it was that they were trying to erase the truth. They were trying to rewrite history in real time, painting themselves as the heroes of a story where they had been, at best, absent antagonists. When I got back to my small apartment, the first thing I saw was the chessboard on my coffee table. It was halfway through a game, the pieces exactly where Grandad and I had left them last Saturday. His king was in a precarious position, but he'd had a cunning little trap set with his rook that I hadn't seen until after he was gone. He was always 3 moves ahead, in chess, and as I was beginning to fully appreciate, in life, I sank onto the couch, the leather sighing under my weight, and let the flashbacks come. They weren't the hazy sepia-toned memories of sentimental movies. They were sharp, vivid, and they served as a brutal counter-narrative to the lies my aunts and uncles had been spinning. I remembered 3 months ago. Grandad had a bad fall. He was okay, mostly bruised and shaken, but the doctor wanted him to transition to the associated nursing home for a couple of weeks of rehab and observation. It was a nice place, as far as those places go, clean and bright, with a garden in the courtyard. I called Aunt Carol first. Oh heavens, is he all right? She'd gasped, the performance already starting. He's fine, just sore. The doctor thinks a short stay at the Pines would be best, just to be safe. A long pause. I could hear her tapping on a keyboard. Well, that's a problem, Alex. Robert and I are leaving for Bermuda on Thursday. It's a conference for his work we can't possibly cancel. It's all paid for. Can't you handle it? Can't you handle it? Not how can we help, or what does he need? Just a delegation. I remembered calling Uncle David next. His excuse was the kids. Oh man, that's terrible timing. Susie has her state soccer tournament this weekend. It's 2 hours away. We're all going. You know how it is. Family first. I'd wanted to scream. He's family. Your father is family. But I just said, okay, Uncle David. I'll let him know. Susan's excuse was the most absurd. I just started this new cleanse, Alex. It's a whole body detox. And the stress would just be, it would throw my system completely out of whack. I need to focus on my wellness right now so I can be there for him later. She never was, of course. Later never came, so I handled it. I spent the afternoon helping Grandad pack a small bag. He was quiet, his pride wounded more than his body. As I was folding his sweaters, he looked at me, his blue eyes still sharp despite the new network of wrinkles around them. They're not coming, are they? He asked. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. They're busy, I said, hating the weak lie. He gave a short, humorless laugh. They've been busies for 5 years, Alex. Ever since I shut down their private bank. He patted the arm of his chair. It's all right, son. Their absence tells me more than their presence ever could. Contrast that with a memory from just a month ago. Grandad was in his room at the nursing home. He had decided to stay on, admitting that he liked having people around and not having to worry about meals. His physical health was declining, but his mind was a razor. I was there, reading him an article from a history magazine about the Battle of Midway. He'd served in the Navy, though he rarely talked about it. Suddenly he put his hand on my arm to stop me. You're a good man, Alex, he said, his voice a little thin, a little reedy, but full of sincerity. You remind me of your grandmother. She didn't talk much either, but she was always there. Presence. That's what matters, not presence. He stared out the window for a moment, at the little garden where a nurse named Maria was tending to some roses. Those people, he said, nodding towards the window. Maria, the boy who brings my meals, the night nurse who checks on me. They ask about my day. They know my stories. They laugh at my terrible jokes. He looked back at me. My own children call once a month to check if I'm still breathing, probably just to make sure their inheritance is still on track. The bitterness in his voice was raw, but it was quickly replaced by that familiar cunning glint in his eye. We need to talk to Albright, he said. It's time to amend the game plan. That was the catalyst. Not for me, but for him. He'd had enough. My own catalyst came right after the funeral, in the reception hall. After Uncle David's transactional offer of a little something, Aunt Carol found me again. She had a plate with a single sad-looking cucumber sandwich on it. Alex, she said, her tone now shifting from concern to managerial. About tomorrow, at the lawyer's office, Robert and I have been talking. We think it would be best if, after the main estate is divided between us children, we set up a small trust for you. Nothing extravagant, of course, but a little something to help you out. We'll manage it for you, naturally, to make sure you're responsible with it. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it hit me like a physical blow. They were going to take his fortune, a fortune built on a lifetime of hard work and smart decisions, and then dole out a pittance to me like I was a child who couldn't be trusted with his allowance. They would manage it. They would control it. It was another way of positioning themselves as the benevolent, responsible adults and me, as the perpetual dependent. You were a good errand boy for him, Alex, she added, trying to sound kind. He was lucky to have you run his little errands. Errand boy. That was it. That was the moment my sadness hardened into something diamond hard and diamond sharp. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money for me. It was about the truth. It was about honor. It was about the memory of the man they were so casually defiling. They saw my weekends with him as errands. They saw my love as a service to be compensated. They saw my relationship with my grandfather as nothing more than a footnote in their own grand greedy narrative. I looked her right in the eye. My voice when I spoke was quiet, but it was as solid as granite. I'll be there, Aunt Carol. I wouldn't miss it for the world. She smiled, mistaking my resolve for acquiescence. Good, she said, and she turned to leave before she added, over her shoulder, oh, and don't speak out of turn. Let the adults handle the important matters. I watched her walk away, her back straight, radiating smug satisfaction. An errand boy, an irresponsible child, a quiet, disrespectful bystander. They had built a neat little box for me, a role they needed me to play in their drama. They had no idea I was about to burn their entire theater to the ground, and Grandad Henry had handed me the matches and the gasoline. My resolve was no longer just about seeing his will executed. It was about making sure they understood, in no uncertain terms, why. Not till you're not. I learned this the hard way, and now I'm here to make sure you don't make the same mistakes. The silence in my apartment was no longer empty. It was filled with purpose. Staring at that chessboard, I felt like my grandfather was right there with me, whispering in my ear, They've made their move, Alex. Now it's ours." They saw me as the quiet grandson, the background character. They had no earthly idea that for the past 6 months, I had been my grandfather's most trusted confidant, his co-conspirator, his first lieutenant, in a meticulously planned final campaign. My quiet grief wasn't a sign of disrespect. It was the perfect cover. It started on a Tuesday, about a week after he decided to stay on at the nursing home. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Alex, it's Charles Albright." Mr. Albright, Grandad's lawyer and his friend since they were young men, he was a legend, a throwback to an era of stoic, no-nonsense legal practice. His voice was like gravel pouring over dry leaves. "Henry wants to see us, both of us. My office, tomorrow at 9 a.m. He said to tell you it's time to castle the king." It was their old chess code. It meant it was time to make a decisive, defensive move to protect the most important piece on the board. The next morning, I picked Grandad up. He was dressed in his best tweed jacket, looking more like a visiting professor than a nursing home resident. In Mr. Albright's office, surrounded by leather-bound books that smelled of justice and time, Grandad laid it all out. "Charles," he began, "my children are circling like sharks. They see a bleeding swimmer, and they're just waiting for the feeding frenzy." Mr. Albright listened, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth. He was the kind of man who listened with his entire being. "They think I'm losing my mind," Grandad continued. "Robert, especially, he thinks senile is a magic word that'll unlock my bank accounts." This was the first I'd heard of a specific attempt. My grandfather saw the question in my eyes and elaborated. "A month ago, Robert tried to get me to sign over power of attorney. He came to the house with his own lawyer, a slick little weasel named Finch. He had papers drawn up. He said it was to help me manage things, to take the burden off my shoulders." A flashback, sharp and ugly, hit me. I remembered that day. I'd arrived at Grandad's house for our usual Saturday lunch, and Robert's silver Mercedes was in the driveway. When I walked in, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Robert and a man in a too-tight suit were standing over my grandfather, who was sitting in his armchair looking furious. "It's just a precaution, Dad," Robert was saying in a placating tone. "It simplifies everything." "The only thing it simplifies, Robert, is the process of you writing checks to yourself from my account." Grandad had snapped back. He saw me in the doorway. "Alex, perfect timing. Come show your uncle and his associate the door." Robert had shot me a look of pure venom. "This doesn't concern him. This is a family matter. Alex is more family to me than you've been in a decade." Grandad had said, his voice dangerously low. "Now get out of my house." They had left, but not before Robert had muttered, "You're making a big mistake, old man. You're not thinking clearly." Now in the lawyer's office, the full picture of that day became clear. It wasn't just a disagreement. It was a failed coup. "He's going to try to have me declared incompetent, Charles," Grandad said. "I know it. So we're going to build a fortress, an ironclad, legally untouchable fortress." And so the secret plan began. Mr. Albright became our general, Grandad the strategist, and I was the man on the ground, his trusted adjutant. The first step was a full, comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. Mr. Albright arranged it with a top forensic psychiatrist, a woman with a reputation for being unshakable in court. I drove Grandad to the appointment. He was charming and witty, recounting details from his Navy days and his business career with crystalline clarity. He aced every cognitive test they threw at him. The final report was unequivocal. Henry Callahan was of exceptionally sound mind and memory, fully capable of managing his own affairs. Mr. Albright filed it, dated and notarized. That was the first brick in our fortress. The second part of the plan was the most audacious. "I want to change my will, Charles," Grandad announced, drastically. He looked at me. "Alex, my boy, your grandmother and I set up a trust for you years ago. It's separate from the estate. It's yours, untouchable, and it will set you up for life. You're taken care of." This he gestured vaguely. "This is about the rest of them. The main estate, the house, the stocks, the investments. They haven't earned it. They don't deserve it. And they're not getting it." "Who is then?" Mr. Albright asked, already pulling out a fresh legal pad. "The people at the Pines," Grandad said without hesitation. "The ones who actually care for me. The nurses, the aides, the kitchen staff, the cleaners. I want to set up an endowment, a permanent fund, bonuses, scholarships for their kids, improvements to the facility. I want it to be called the Callahan Sunshine Fund." He smiled. "Because my children have brought me nothing but clouds." Over the next few weeks we worked in secret. I became a regular at Mr. Albright's office, shuttling documents back and forth for Grandad to sign. We meticulously liquidated certain assets and transferred them into a charitable trust, a complex legal structure that Mr. Albright assured us was as unbreachable as Fort Knox. The house was put into a separate trust, with instructions for it to be sold and the proceeds added to the fund. Every I was dotted, every I was crossed. Every potential loophole Robert's weasel lawyer might try to exploit was anticipated and sealed shut. The final piece of the plan was the video. It was Grandad's idea. "A letter is too quiet," he'd said. "They'll have Robert's lawyer read it in a monotone. There's no theater. I want to look them in their greedy little eyes, even if I'm not there." We set it up in his room at the nursing home one afternoon. I used my phone, propped up on a stack of books. The lighting was good, the sun streaming in from the garden window. He practiced his lines. He wanted it to be perfect. "How's this?" he'd ask, clearing his throat. "To my darling children, who valued my bank balance more than my beating heart." "A little too dramatic, Grandad," I'd laughed. You're right. Subtlety is more powerful." He decided on the cheerful, almost breezy tone. It was far more devastating. He recorded the first part, the message to me. His voice was warm, full of genuine affection. He thanked me for the chess games, for the conversations, for my presence. He told me he was proud of me. I had to fight back a lump in my throat, knowing that this was his real goodbye to me. Then he took a deep breath, looked straight into the lens, and his whole demeanor shifted. The warmth was gone, replaced by a steely, unimpeachable clarity. He was no longer a frail old man. He was Henry Callahan, the man who built a business from nothing, the man who never suffered fools. "As for the rest of you," he began, his voice even and calm. "Robert, Carol, Susan, David. I've been doing some math. The last time all four of you were in the same room with me, to wish me a Merry Christmas, was December 25th, 2018. That was over 4 years ago. 4 years of excuses, of forgotten birthdays, of silence." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "So I've made a new arrangement. I have concluded that my legacy, the fruits of my life's work, should go to those who have shown me kindness and care in my final chapter. Therefore, I have already donated your share of the inheritance, in its entirety, to an endowment for the staff of this fine establishment." He smiled, a thin, final checkmate of a smile. "I'm sure you'll understand. After all, you were all far too busy to be burdened with it." When he finished, he slumped back in his chair, suddenly looking exhausted but profoundly satisfied. "Think that'll do it?" he asked me, a twinkle returning to his eye. I just grinned. "Yeah, Grandad, I think that'll do it." We saved the video file, made 3 separate copies, and gave one to Mr. Albright. The hidden leverage was in place. We had foreseen their every move, and we had built a fortress of truth and legality around my grandfather's final wishes. They were walking into that will reading expecting a coronation. They had no idea they were walking into an ambush, one that we had been planning for months. And as I stood there at the funeral, accepting their condescending sympathy, I felt a grim satisfaction. The board was set. The pieces were in position. All I had to do was wait for them to make their final fatal move. The day of the will reading dawned bright and cold. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue that felt like a mockery of the dark, stuffy ordeal ahead. I chose my suit carefully. It was a simple, well-fitting charcoal gray suit, the one I wore for important occasions. It wasn't a suit of mourning, it was my armor. It projected quiet competence, a stark contrast to the flamboyant grief my aunts and uncles would no doubt be sporting. Mr. Albright's office was on the top floor of a downtown skyscraper, a world away from the hushed gloom of the funeral home. The waiting room was a study in corporate power, polished marble floors, abstract art, and a panoramic view of the city. I was the first to arrive. The receptionist, a prim woman with a kind smile, offered me coffee. I accepted, needing the warmth of the mug in my hands. My family arrived in a staggered, dramatic procession. Carol and Robert came first. Carol was in a severe black dress, a single strand of pearls at her throat. She looked less like a grieving daughter, and more like a deposed queen plotting her return to power. Robert was on his phone, barking orders at some underling, projecting an air of self-importance that filled the room like a noxious gas. He gave me a curt nod, the kind you give a doorman. Susan and David arrived a few minutes later, arm in arm, still playing their roles as the sensitive, wounded souls. Susan's eyes were puffy. She'd clearly put in the effort to look like she'd been crying all night. David gave me a weak, pitying smile. "Hangin' in there, Alex?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said, my voice neutral. The four of them immediately formed a tight, whispering circle, pointedly excluding me. I could catch snippets of their conversation. "The house has to be worth at least $2 million in this market," Robert was saying. "I want Mom's pearls. She always promised them to me," Carol insisted. "A nice little nest egg to pay off the mortgage." David sighed contentedly. They were carving up my grandfather's life before he was even cold in the ground. They were so certain, so smugly assured of the outcome. Their arrogance was a palpable force, a thick blanket of entitlement that was about to be yanked away. This was the silent takeover in action. My move was to simply exist, to watch, to know what they didn't. Every calm sip of my coffee, every quiet moment I held their gaze, was a tiny act of defiance against the narrative they had constructed. Mr. Albright's assistant called us back. His personal office was even more imposing. A massive mahogany desk stood before a floor-to-ceiling window. The chairs we were directed to were plush leather, positioned in a semicircle facing the desk. It felt less like a legal proceeding, and more like an audience. I deliberately took the chair at the end, furthest from the family huddle. Mr. Albright entered, his presence immediately commanding the room's full attention. He was carrying a slim leather-bound folio. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and looked at each of us in turn. His gaze lingered on me for a fraction of a second longer, a barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement. Our alliance was silent but solid. "Good morning," he began, his voice dry as dust. "We are here to execute the last will and testament of Henry Callahan. I will now read the document. Please hold all questions until the end." He began with the usual legal boilerplate. My aunts and uncles shifted impatiently. They wanted to get to the good part. First, Mr. Albright continued. "To my dear friend Charles Albright, I leave my prized 1954 edition of The Art of War, and my eternal gratitude for a lifetime of sound counsel." Mr. Albright paused, cleared his throat, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine emotion on his face before his professional mask slipped back into place. "Next, there are a few personal effects." He read from the list. "To my daughter Carol, I leave the cuckoo clock from the hallway. You always said its incessant noise drove you mad. Now you can enjoy its charming call every hour on the hour in your own home." Carol's face tightened. A muscle in her jaw jumped. It was a petty, passive-aggressive jab from beyond the grave, and it was glorious. "To my son Robert, I leave my collection of fly fishing ties. You haven't been fishing in 30 years, but you always like to tell the story. Now you have the props. Robert's face flushed a dull, angry red. To my daughter Susan, I leave my entire collection of National Geographic magazines, dating back to 1968. You always said you wanted to travel the world. Now you can from the comfort of your own home, without the stress of it all. Susan looked utterly bewildered, as if she couldn't comprehend why her father would leave her a pile of old magazines. And to my son David, I leave my old lawnmower. You borrowed it in 2015, and never returned it. I'm just making the ownership official. David just blinked, speechless. The air in the room was thick with confusion and rising anger. This was not going according to their script. This was a prelude to something they couldn't comprehend. Their panic was just beginning to simmer. Is that it? Robert finally blurted out, unable to contain himself. A bunch of junk? What about the estate? The assets? Mr. Albright held up a hand. As I said, please hold all questions. I am not finished. He took a slow, deliberate sip of water from a glass on his desk. He was enjoying this. He was the conductor, and the chaotic symphony was just beginning. Regarding my grandson Alex, Mr. Albright read, and all their heads swiveled to look at me. As Alex is already provided for by a separate trust established by his grandmother and myself, I leave him my chessboard and my deepest thanks for his companionship. The greatest gift he gave me was his time, something which requires no legal documentation to transfer. I met their glares with a calm expression. They were looking at me with suspicion now, the gears in their heads grinding. They were starting to see me not as a piece of furniture, but as a player in a game they didn't know they were playing. The panic was escalating. Now Mr. Albright said, setting the folio aside, we come to the matter of the primary assets of the estate. The house, the investment portfolio, the cash accounts. Henry was very specific about his wishes here. In fact, he wanted to tell you himself. He swiveled his monitor around and picked up a remote. The screen, previously showing a serene landscape, flickered to life. And suddenly, there was my grandfather. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The simmering panic of my aunts and uncles erupted into a full-blown inferno of shock and fury. The moment the video ended, the moment my grandfather's smiling, triumphant face faded to black, the silence that followed was a physical thing. It was a black hole, sucking all the air, all the sound, all the smug certainty out of the room. It lasted for precisely 3 seconds. Then came the explosion. No, it was a shriek, high and ragged, torn from Aunt Carol's throat. No, he can't do that. That's our money, our legacy. This is a joke. Robert sputtered, his face a blotchy, apoplectic purple. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. This is absolute insanity. The old man was senile. He was out of his mind. We'll contest this. We'll have this whole farce thrown out of court. He whirled on me, his fingers stabbing the air. You did this. You got into his head. You poisoned him against his own family. You manipulated a sick old man. Susan had dissolved into hysterical, gulping sobs, but these were not the delicate, performative tears of the funeral. This was the raw, ugly crying of a child who'd had her favorite toy snatched away. Everything. It's all gone, she wailed into David's chest. David, for his part, looked shell-shocked, his mind unable to process the new reality. The nursing home? He kept mumbling. He gave it all to the nursing home.
This was their desperate counter-manipulation, the flailing of cornered animals, the accusations, the threats, the tears. It was all designed to shift the blame, to paint themselves as the victims and me as the villain. They thought if they yelled loud enough, they could bend reality back to their will. But Mr. Albright was the immovable object to their unstoppable force of greed. He hadn't flinched. He simply waited for the initial tsunami of rage to recede into mere tidal waves of fury. Mr. Callahan, he said, his voice cutting through Robert's tirade like a surgeon's scalpel. I would advise you to sit down and lower your voice. I will not sit down, Robert roared. I want to see the medical records. I want to see his psychiatric evaluations. I'll get a court order. My lawyer will be all over this before you can. That won't be necessary, Mr. Albright said calmly. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick file, dropping it onto the desk with a heavy, definitive thud. This is the file from your attempt to gain power of attorney over your father 6 months ago. As you'll recall, you made the claim that he was mentally unfit to manage his affairs. He opened the file. In response, your father voluntarily underwent a full psychiatric evaluation with Dr. Evelyn Reed, one of the top forensic psychiatrists in the state. I have her full 20-page report here. The conclusion, and I quote, is that Mr. Henry Callahan is of exceptionally sound mind, demonstrating cognitive and memory functions well above the average for his age demographic. The report is dated just 2 weeks before he recorded that video message. Robert stared at the file as if it were a venomous snake. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Check. Mr. Albright wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, pulling out another thinner folder, we have sworn and notarized affidavits from 6 different staff members at the Pines, nurses and aides detailing the frequency of your family's visits over the past year, or, I should say, the lack thereof. They also detail your father's state of mind, his lucidity, and his repeated statements about his intentions for his estate, all of which corroborate the video you just saw. He looked directly at Robert. Any judge in this state will see this for what it is, a baseless, vindictive challenge by a disinherited son. It will be dismissed in minutes, and you may even face sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit. Do you really want to proceed? The fight drained out of Robert's face, replaced by the pale, clammy look of total defeat. Checkmate. Carol, seeing the legal avenue closing, tried a different tactic. She turned on me, her eyes blazing with hatred. How could you, Alex? After everything we did for you, we were going to give you a trust. We were going to take care of you, you ungrateful little snake. This was my moment. All the errand boy comments, all the condescension, all the casual cruelty, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. A trust? I said, my voice even. You mean my allowance? The one you would manage for me because I'm not a responsible adult? The one you were going to fund after you carved up everything he ever worked for? I stood up, walking slowly toward the desk, toward them. You talk about being his children, his family. Let's talk about family. Family is showing up. Family is calling. Family is not letting your own father spend his last Christmas alone because you were all too busy. I looked at each of them. Christmas 2018. Grandad remembered the exact date. I remember it too. He sat at his dining room table with places set for all of you, just in case you decided to surprise him. He waited until 4 p.m. before he let me clear the table. He never did that again. I turned to David. You promised him you'd come fix the leaky faucet in his bathroom. You promised him that 6 times. I'm the one who ended up fixing it. I turned to Susan. The last time you called him, you spent 10 minutes complaining about your contractor and never once asked him how he was feeling. He told me he timed it. I looked at Robert. He didn't need me to poison him against you. Your own neglect was the poison. You didn't see a father. You saw a bank account with a heartbeat. Finally, I looked at Carol, and you called me an errand boy. You're right. I ran errands for him. I got his groceries. I picked up his prescriptions. I drove him to his appointments. But in between those errands, I listened to his stories. I played chess with him. I learned from him. I loved him. My relationship with him wasn't a transaction. Yours was. And today the account was closed. The family exodus began. Carol let out a strangled sob of pure rage and stormed out of the room. Robert, his face a mask of impotent fury, followed her without another word. Susan stumbled after them, still crying, with David trailing behind, looking utterly broken. They were gone. The storm had passed. The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of victory. The silence of justice. I looked at Mr. Albright. He was looking at the empty doorway, a slow, grimly satisfied smile spreading across his face. Well, he said, turning to me. I believe that went exactly according to plan. The days following the will reading were a blur of quiet administration and loud, desperate fallout from a distance. My phone blew up with calls and texts from my aunts and uncles. They cycled through the 5 stages of grief, but for them it was the 5 stages of greed. denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally accusation. I didn't answer. I let their frantic messages go to voicemail, a digital archive of their spectacular implosion. Robert left threats of lawsuits, which eventually petered out into angry, rambling monologues. Carol left tearful, manipulative messages about what would your grandmother think, and how I had torn this family apart. Susan just sent a string of crying emojis. David was the only one who sounded genuinely broken, leaving one short, sad message. He really hated us, didn't he? I didn't engage. It wasn't my battle anymore. It was theirs. They were left to grapple with a new reality, one where they weren't the wealthy heirs in waiting, but the publicly shamed children of a man who saw right through them. The news traveled fast through their social circles. Mr. Albright, as the executor, had to formally notify the estate's contacts, and the story was just too good, too deliciously karmic, to stay contained. Robert, the big-shot financial advisor, was humiliated. How could you be a master of money when you couldn't even secure your own father's inheritance? Carol, who prided herself on her social standing, became a subject of pity and gossip at her country club. Their performance at the funeral, so grand and convincing at the time, was now retroactively seen for what it was, a desperate, greedy farce. They had been exposed not by me, but by my grandfather's simple, unassailable truth. My confrontation wasn't with them anymore. It was with my grandfather's legacy. A week later, Mr. Albright and I went to the Pines. We didn't just mail a check. Grandad would have wanted more theater than that. Mr. Albright had arranged a meeting with the facility director and all the staff who were on duty. We gathered in the sunny common room, the same room where I'd spent so many hours with Grandad. The director, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, introduced us. There was a nervous energy in the room. The staff probably thought they were in some kind of trouble. Mr. Albright, in his element, cleared his throat and began. As the executor of the estate of the late Henry Callahan, I have been entrusted with carrying out his final wishes. Henry was very fond of the care and the community he found here in his final months. He let that hang in the air for a moment. So fond, in fact, that he has directed the entirety of his residual estate, a significant sum, to the establishment of a new permanent endowment. A murmur went through the crowd. This endowment, Mr. Albright continued, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips, will be called the Henry Callahan Sunshine Fund. Its sole purpose is to benefit the staff and residents of this facility. It will provide annual holiday bonuses for every single employee, from the head nurse to the kitchen staff. It will fund a scholarship program for the children of employees, and it will provide an annual budget for resident activities and facility improvements, as determined by the staff themselves. The stunned silence was a mirror image of the one in his office, but this one was filled with disbelief and dawning joy. A few people gasped. I saw Maria, my grandfather's favorite nurse, the one he always saved his best jokes for, put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears. After the official announcement, the room erupted in applause and emotional chatter. Maria came over to me, her face shining. Alex, she said, grabbing my hands. I don't know what to say. Your grandfather, he was such a special man. He talked about you all the time. He called you his first lieutenant. She was crying openly now. He told me, Maria, that boy is solid oak. He doesn't bend in the wind. He would be so happy to see this. I felt a lump form in my throat. That was the vindication. Not the look of defeat on my relatives' faces, but the look of pure, unadulterated joy on Maria's. This was the new reality. My grandfather's life's work wasn't going to fund a new boat for Robert or a kitchen remodel for Carol. It was going to help Maria's son go to college. It was going to give the night aide who always had a kind word a bonus he could use to fix his car. It was going to buy new books for the library and plant a new rose garden in the courtyard. His money wasn't just money anymore. It had been transformed into kindness. It had become a legacy. I confronted my own new reality as well. The trust my grandmother and grandfather had set up for me was substantial. I didn't have to worry about money, but more than that, I felt a sense of freedom. I wasn't the errand boy anymore. I wasn't the quiet, overlooked nephew. I was my grandfather's trusted partner. I had honored his memory and executed his final brilliant plan. I had stood up to my family's greed and hypocrisy, and had come out the other side, not with anger, but with a profound sense of peace. My last confrontation was a private one. A few days later, I drove out to the cemetery. It was a quiet afternoon. I stood before his grave, the headstone simple and elegant, just as he'd wanted. Henry Callahan, a good man. I didn't say anything out loud. I just stood there feeling the cool breeze, and I set up the small portable chessboard I'd brought with me on the grass. I placed the pieces exactly as we had left them in our final game. His king was still in danger, but his rook was perfectly positioned for that clever unforeseen trap. It was his move. But in the end I realized the game was already over. He had won. They thought legacy was something you inherit, something you take. They believed love was a performance you stage for an audience, and that grief was a costume you wear to a party. But my grandfather knew the truth. He taught me that legacy is something you build, something you give away. He showed me that love is quiet, it's found in the steady, unwavering presence of another person, in the shared silences and the easy laughter. And real grief isn't loud and theatrical. It's a silent, aching space where a great man used to be. My aunts and uncles, in their desperate clamor for his money, had missed the point entirely. They never understood that the greatest inheritance he had to give wasn't in his bank account. It was in his character. And that, I'm proud to say, is the part of him I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Thank you for listening to my story. It's a strange thing, family. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the furthest from your heart, and the people who show you simple, everyday kindness become the ones who matter most. It took this whole ordeal for me to fully understand that lesson. A final gift from my grandfather. If you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated by your own family, I hope my story gives you a little bit of strength. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one with the most power, and the best victory is the one that proves character is worth more than cash. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about getting the last laugh. And I'd love to read your own experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had to deal with performative relatives or inheritance drama? Let's talk about it. Thanks again for being here.